There are now more than 1,000 studies that link ultra-processed foods to poor health outcome, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, overall mortality, susceptibility to COVID-19, you name it.
What percentage of the American diet is ultra-processed?
Oh, 70.
Today we talk with Dr. Marion Nestle.
Scientist and acclaimed author, Dr. Marion Nestle.
One of the most important foodies in the world.
Dr. Nestle is a molecular biologist, nutritionist, and public health advocate.
Founder of the field of food studies.
Most people eat these foods. They're the most heavily advertised foods that are designed to be irresistibly delicious, if not addictive, and extremely palatable. They have a name for it. It's called the bliss point.
Yeah.
It's the point at which you just don't want to stop eating. They're the foods that are most profitable for their manufacturers. And when you're going up and down the supermarket aisles, looking at foods that are in packages, most of them are ultra-processed. So the system is rigged. And the system is rigged against a food company trying to do something that will benefit public health.
Do you feel like food companies kind of have blood on their hands? Today we have the privilege of sitting down with Dr. Marion Nestle. Dr. Nestle is a molecular biologist, nutritionist, and public health advocate. With a career spanning over 50 years, she's been at the front lines fighting the corruption in the food industry for longer than many of us have lived. She's authored dozens of books, and many consider her to be the top food researcher in the entire world. In fact, Forbes ranked her number 2 on their list of most important foodies. Dr. Nestle has given talks at Google, the Nobel Prize, the World Economic Forum, the Washington Post, the New York Times, in addition to countless others. Most recently, Dr. Nestle was featured in 2 critically acclaimed Netflix documentaries, Living to 100 and Poisoned. In this conversation, we'll be unpacking one of the biggest injustices in the world today, which is that food companies are knowingly feeding us products that cause disease and early death. It's happening right under our nose, but it gets a fraction of the attention that it should. For this reason, we believe this is one of the more important conversations that we've had. If we all don't pay attention to this issue, it will likely impact our future simply by just going to the grocery store or out to eat. We believe that the awareness that will come from this conversation could keep you out of the hospital or prevent you from developing a disease. Change starts with awareness, and listening to this entire conversation is one of the better investments you can make for your health and for your future. And without further ado, Dr. Marion Nestle. Well, thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Your work is incredible, just pioneer with the food industry, and I think it just paved the way for so many conversations happening for the next generation on, what exactly is happening, what's being put in our food. I'm just really excited for this. So I wanted to kick this off by talking about processed food, because you can't really understand, what's going on with the food industry and the corruption unless you understand why processed food is so bad for us. There's a doctor out in San Francisco. He wrote a book called Metabolical, and he called processed food slow poison. So he wrote, unlike salmonella, you won't be feeling the effects immediately, but eventually you'll feel it everywhere, in your heart, muscles, bladder, brain, and especially your wallet. So I just wanted to kick it off by asking, can you kind of just give us a beginner's crash course into what processed food is and why it's bad for us?
Well, we never worried about processed food until very recently. Foods have always been processed. They've been preserved, that's processing. They've been transported, they've been salted, they've been sugared, they've been dried. All kinds of things are done. Cooked food is a form of processing.
Yeah.
So it's not processing in general that you're concerned about. What you're concerned about is what is now called ultra-processing, which is a new term.
Yeah.
It was a term invented in 2009, so that wasn't all that long ago.
Yeah.
By a professor at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, who defined categories of processing. Unprocessed foods, slightly processed foods, processed food ingredients, combinations of those, and then a specific category called ultra-processed, which refers to foods that are industrially produced designed to be irresistibly delicious, if not addictive, and extremely palatable.
Yeah.
And that you can't make them in home kitchens because you don't have the equipment or the ingredients.
Yeah.
And so the classic example is corn. Corn on the cob is unprocessed. Canned corn is processed. You don't worry about those. What you worry about is Dorito chips, which you couldn't reproduce in your home kitchen because they're made industrially.
Yeah.
And it's those foods which are now associated in vast numbers of study with poor health outcome. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, overall mortality, susceptibility to COVID-19, you name it. There are now more than 1,000 studies that link...
1,000?
More than 1,000 that link ultra-processed foods to poor health outcome. And there is one, and those are associations, so they don't say anything about causation.
Yeah.
But there is one extremely well-controlled clinical trial that demonstrates that ultra-processed foods induce people to eat more calories and eat more food in general than they would if they were eating just processed foods.
Yeah.
And that is an example of why these things are now considered addictive, irresistibly delicious. You can't eat just one, the famous advertisement. You can't eat just one. That's what that's about.
So you mentioned the disease thing, which we're going to circle back on in a minute, but what percentage of the American diet is ultra-processed
Oh,
food?
70?
70%.
Roughly, somewhere between 50 and 70%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's most people eat these foods. They're the most heavily advertised foods. They're the foods that are most profitable for their manufacturers. And when you're going up and down the supermarket aisles, looking at foods that are in packages, most of them are ultra-processed.
Yeah. I feel like when we go downstairs from our apartment in Harlem and just go to the convenience store, it's like the entire store is basically what you're talking about. It's just it feels like it just surrounds you like everywhere.
Well, yeah, because they're easier to store.
Yeah.
You can buy the ingredients when they're very inexpensive, keep them on the shelf forever, and sell them when they're profitable. And they're just enormously, enormously profitable. And they were formulated to be irresistibly delicious. And this is the work of Michael Moss, who's written a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat, and another one, I can't remember the title, but he's got 2 books demonstrating that once you start eating these things, you can't stop.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big thing. So I think one big part of the conversation, I mean, for the average person, they think junk food, and I don't think they really internalize what's being done to their food. There's kind of 4 categories I wanted to cover, and we could do this step by step. But the first one is like food additives. So what are food additives?
Well, they're chemicals that are added to food. The usual ones are to preserve them, to make them taste better. So they're artificial flavors, artificial colors, texturizers to give them a nice mouthfeel. One of the things that processing does is to take the taste and the texture out of foods. So you got to add enough back so that people will want to eat it. Food colors would be an example.
Yeah.
Though people won't eat candy if it's gray. They want the candy to be bright red or bright blue or bright green or bright yellow.
Psychological thing.
Or white.
But a lot of these additives are banned in Europe and not the United States.
Some are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the FDA doesn't do much with food additives.
Yeah.
Big issue.
And so the second thing is pesticides. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, pesticides are used to grow crops and to grow plants in general, to keep pests off of them. All foods have pesticides on them, even organic ones, although organic have much less and much less dangerous ones. But they're in the food supply. They're in everything.
Yeah. And so there's this case in 2016 with Monsanto around pesticides. Are you familiar with that? And so what happened there?
Well, there have been several cases.
Yeah.
Monsanto has been bought by the drug company Bayer in Germany. A very big mistake on Bayer's part.
Yeah.
They've lost a lot of money over this. And there are now thousands of cases against Monsanto from people who used the herbicide, Roundup, glyphosate, and say that they developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as a result. And there have been some court cases that have ruled in the plaintiff's favor, and Monsanto had to pay big judgments, but now it's Bayer that has to pay the judgment. And Bayer has tried to settle those cases with $12 billion, but there's so many cases, that's not going to come close to covering it.
Yeah. And so the last two categories are like GMOs and growth hormones. Can you unpack those two?
Well, GMOs are genetically modified foods. There's a very, very small list of what those are. If you go into a supermarket, you won't find in the produce section, you'll be very unlikely to find anything that's genetically modified. I can count them on the fingers of one hand.
Yeah.
There's a pink pineapple. They're mostly they're not on the market. What the genetically modified foods are generally crops. Soybeans and corn that have been genetically modified to resist glyphosate, pests, Roundup, or to resist insects. And those are in absolutely everything, and they're supposed to be labeled, and they are to some extent if you have a magnifying glass and are reading labels carefully.
Yeah. So when it comes to the food industry, like, are food companies fully aware of that, and like the products that they're creating? Like,
well, of course they are. But food companies are not social service agencies, and they're not public health agencies.
Yeah.
They're businesses with stockholders to please. That means that they have one goal and one goal only in today's investing environment, and that's to please their stockholders.
Yeah.
This is a way in which our investment system has behaved starting in the early 1980s when the shareholder value movement came into prominence. And the sole purpose of corporations is not to protect their communities, not to make sure that their workers have enough money to buy their products. Their sole purpose is to make money for stockholders.
Yeah.
And a lot of the problems in our society result from that.
What seems like particularly evil about the entire thing, I mean, there's a lot of parallels between, and you've talked about this a little bit in your book, but big pharma and the big food companies and kind of like the whole playbook around all this, which we'll get into in a minute, which you documented in your books. I thought it was interesting when you published Food Politics, which covered the food industry in depth. You wrote in the industry that I'm in the intro that I could not find anyone who would speak to me on the record for this book. Why was that?
Well, that was because I was asking questions about corporate focuses. And nobody wanted to speak on the record and be quoted as saying, well, we don't really care about our workers. We don't care about our customers. We only care about profits to shareholders. Nobody wanted to say that.
Yeah.
And in fact, I can only remember one instance where somebody said it publicly and it wasn't really a public statement. And this was at a conference at the White House on food marketing to children, where after the eloquent speeches about how companies should lay off marketing to children, a food industry executive said at a private meeting, well, we wish we didn't have to market to children. We think it's wrong, but our stockholders won't let us stop. And that was the baldest, most explicit statement I'd ever heard of that. Had anybody say in a place where there were witnesses. So no, nobody wants to talk about this, but it's the truth.
Yeah. I can't believe they openly said that.
Well, it was a meeting where you weren't supposed to quote anyone.
Yeah. Do you feel like food companies, just in general, kind of have blood on their hands when it comes to this stuff?
I think they have blinders on. I mean, I've talked to people who work in food companies. They think they're doing good work. They're making products that people like. One of their arguments is we're not forcing people to eat our products. We're making products that people love to eat.
Yeah.
And people do love to eat ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. Michael Moss discussed that in his books.
It makes you feel good.
They taste, they do focus group testing to make sure that the products reach what they have a name for it. It's called the bliss point.
Yeah.
It's the point at which you just don't want to stop eating
Yeah.
the products because they taste so good and they feel so good on your teeth and in your mouth. And that's so they're just producing products that people like. So from their standpoint, that's what they're doing. They're producing products that people like.
Yeah.
Why would they want to do anything to stop people from buying them?
Yeah. Well, I guess the flip side would be if what you're creating is causing chronic disease and early death, then
Well, let's talk about the cigarette industry as an example
yeah.
of an industry that knew 50 years before there was really widespread opposition, 50 years, that they were producing a product that caused lung cancer.
Yeah.
Caused, not associated, caused lung cancer. And they did everything they could for the next 50 years to distract attention from the research, to cast doubt on the research, to cast doubt on the scientists and physicians who were arguing that cigarettes cause lung cancer.
Yeah.
They lobbied. They did everything possible to keep people smoking cigarettes for the longest time possible. That's the playbook.
Yeah.
And when cigarette companies bought food companies, they taught those food companies how to use the playbook.
Yeah.
And there's now very good evidence for that teaching because they've got emails and they've got letters and they've got documents. I mean, a lot of these materials have come to light, and food companies learned the lesson very well. So if your product looks like it causes harm, the first thing you do is cast doubt on the research.
Yeah.
And then you hire your own research.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing you mentioned earlier, we were just talking about this last night, the idea of choice is kind of funny to me because, again, you walk into the convenience store, you walk into the grocery store, this food just around you everywhere. We'll talk about like slotting food. It's just like put in your face. On top of that, like you said, the test groups of like how addictive it is and how it tastes, and it's like, and then the marketing behind all of it as well. You walk in Times Square and there's a giant bottle of like Pepsi or something like right in your face, like a billboard. So like it's all like, even the food coloring, like you said, it's like it's a deeply psychological thing. So let's talk about the playbook a little bit. One thing that you talked about in your books was kind of like the eat more agenda. So tell me about that.
Well, if you're a food company, what do you want? You want people to buy your product. I mean, it's really simple.
Yeah.
It's really simple. So you do everything possible to make sure that people want to buy your product and do buy your product, and that no government agency does anything that's going to make people question buying your product. That's your goal.
Yeah.
Because you're interested in shareholder value. That's your purpose in life. And you have one single focus, and that's it. And you put all your resources into it. You hire lobbyists to make sure that no government agency does anything that's going to interfere with that. I mean, it seems very straightforward to me, and any other expectation is unrealistic. I mean, you want food companies to not produce products that are unhealthy when they're making them $1 billion a year? That's unrealistic if their goal is shareholder value.
Yeah.
And their goal is shareholder value. That's what they're about. That's how the system works.
Yeah.
So the system is rigged. And the system is rigged against a food company trying to do something that will benefit public health or benefit the environment for that matter, which is why they do so much health washing and greenwashing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even what's interesting about the Eat More agenda is I was watching a talk that you did with the Nobel Prize, and you had this whole chart on there of the portion sizes and like the amount of food we're actually consuming compared to like 1950, just in a single setting, like a hamburger or something, or not. Can you talk about that a little bit? Portions?
Yeah, portion size. We have to go back to 1980.
Yeah.
So in 1980, a lot of things happened. President Reagan was elected on a deregulatory agenda. At that point, the food production system was enormously overproducing food. So that between 1980 and 2000, in that 20-year period, the food supply went from providing 3,200 calories a day per capita, men, women, little tiny babies, to 4,000 calories per day per capita, which is roughly twice what the population needs on average.
That's crazy.
On average. So by the year 2000, we had twice as many calories as were needed by the population. And so in that 20-year period, food companies had to learn how to sell more food. And in order to do that, they created what I call an eat more food environment, food everywhere. I mean, when I first went to NYU, there were signs all over the library with books and cockroaches crawling over them saying, don't bring food into the library. If you bring food into the library, you're going to ruin the books and we're going to expel you.
Yeah.
Now there are 2 cafes in the library. Clothing stores. Bookstores, you couldn't bring a cup of coffee into a bookstore.
Yeah.
In 1980, you sure can now. There are cafes in every bookstore in America.
Yeah.
Right? So that's moving food into places where it had never been sold before. Then the food industry sponsored a lot of research to demonstrate that snacking was good for you. And that, really what you wanted to do was snack, not eat meals, when in fact the research shows that the more times a day you eat, the more calories you take in.
Yeah.
And then portion sizes got bigger. And companies were able to make larger portions because the cost of food was so cheap because there was so much of it, supply and demand.
Yeah.
Twice as much food available, therefore the basic ingredients don't cost that much, therefore you can make bigger portions because your main costs are real estate and labor. And so large portions got introduced. And I remember when large muffins came in, I couldn't believe it. Muffins went from being 200 calories to 600 or 800 calories.
Wow.
And they didn't taste nearly as good
Yeah.
because the surface to volume ratio changed, and you had to put in a lot of baking powder in order to get them to rise. I didn't think they were very good, but people got used to them very quickly. They liked them.
Yeah.
People liked larger portions. The size of bagels increased. The size of muffins increased. Fast food portions increased. Everything got supersized. And I had a doctoral student who documented when those products were introduced and how much larger products are now
Yeah.
than they were in 1980.
Yeah.
Well, if I had one concept to get across, it would be that larger portions have more calories.
Yeah.
And I can't even say it with a straight face because it's not, it seems so obvious, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's not intuitively obvious. People have no idea how many calories are in foods, and they don't have a clue as to how many more calories there are in a larger portion.
Yeah.
And we know this because this same doctoral student, Lisa Young, did an experiment in a class that she was teaching where she asked people how many calories were in an 8-ounce sugar-sweetened beverage and how many were in a 64-ounce sugar-sweetened beverage. And she didn't expect people to know how many calories were in a 8-ounce Coke, but she certainly expected them to multiply by 8.
Yeah.
And in fact, the average multiplier was 3.
Wow.
And so I said, Lisa, go back to class. Ask your class. Well, I mean, even the most mathematically challenged NYU freshman ought to be able to multiply by 8.
Yeah.
And so she went back and asked her class, how come? And they said 800 calories in a soda is impossible.
Yeah.
It's impossible that there could be that many calories in something I'm drinking, but it's not.
Yeah.
And so people didn't realize it. They started eating more. Guess what? They gained weight.
Yeah. I mean, the obesity rate right now, I think it's 40%. 42%?
42.
42%?
42% obese, and 70% of American adults are overweight or obese.
Yeah, which is
It's-
something like 4 times what it was in the
At
1950s.
least.
Something
Yeah,
like
it's
that.
become normal.
Yeah,
And among children, it's 20%, and that's
Yeah.
becoming increasingly normalized.
yeah. We posted something today about even the sugar content in one can of Pepsi is more than the daily recommended.
It's a little
limit.
less. It depends how big the can is.
Yeah, well, 12-ounce can. Yeah,
12-ounce can. It's a little bit less, but it's close.
yeah, yeah. Another aspect of the playbook, I think, is the illusion of great prices. Kind of like this idea of like getting the biggest bang for your buck. But obviously, like cheap food comes at a cost. And so can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to eat a lot, one of the great ironies of the American food supply is that junk food is cheaper than healthy food.
Yeah.
When people complain about healthy food being expensive, it's because it is relatively.
Yeah.
So the Department of Commerce produces data on the increase in prices of foods of various categories over time. And their data show all prices have increased with inflation, but the price of junk food has increased much, much less than the average price of food, and also much, much, much less than the price of fruits and vegetables
Yeah.
and other healthy foods. So a lot of that has to do with government policies around foods,
Yeah.
where big agriculture gets the supports, and the result of that is that the cost of basic food of junk food ingredients is very low.
Yeah.
So companies can buy the ingredients at a very low price, charge a high price for it at the
Yeah.
store.
Which is why, this whole problem exists kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It's profitable. And so, yeah. And then the other thing you talk about a lot is this idea of kind of creating mass confusion, specifically in unsavory truth. You talk about this a lot, but creating mass confusion around the data, around health. And you said in food politics, as a nutritionist, I cannot go anywhere without being asked why nutrition advice is so confusing. I think much of the audience probably listening right now resonates with that. So how exactly do food companies kind of like distort the studies around these subjects?
Well, all they have to do is cast doubt on the research. They can do that with research of their own. They can criticize the research that's been done. I mean, we saw this beautifully laid out with Coca-Cola when Coca-Cola was caught. I don't think Coca-Cola is any different than any other food company, but it got caught.
Yeah.
And it got caught in a particularly embarrassing situation where a group called the Global Energy Balance Network that was arguing that it didn't matter what you ate or drank in terms of obesity, what mattered was how physically active you were. And they just didn't happen to mention that they were funded by Coca-Cola, but somebody found it out. And so there was a big scandal about that. And the resulting embarrassment was that a lot of correspondence between these researchers and Coca-Cola was obtained through Freedom of Information Act, and the correspondence was very embarrassing because it showed that Coca-Cola had interfered and influenced and done everything possible to promote this idea and to work closely with these researchers. But I think lots of companies do this, and Coca-Cola got caught.
Yeah.
But I think it's common practice that if a company can find a researcher who's willing to do a study that will be beneficial to the company, they'll buy that research.
Why would the researcher do that then?
Because they need research money to do their research. Universities expect researchers to get grants, and maybe they're not thinking that there's anything wrong with it.
Yeah.
Or not realizing that if you take money from anybody that you take money from is going to have an influence over the way you deal with that money, whether you recognize it or not, and mostly you don't. People don't recognize the influence of gifts in general. There's a big literature on that. And so, they do this research. Coca-Cola funded an enormous amount of research to demonstrate that sugar-sweetened beverages are harmless. Anybody who says that there's harm from sugar-sweetened beverages is doing research that's so flawed you don't have to pay any attention to it.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so then the trickle-down effect when it comes to the media end. So, let's just say a study's done, and then a media outlet then picks it up, and they're like, oh, added sugar is harmless or something like that.
Yeah, the media loves stories like that.
Yeah.
They just love it. Because, you write stories now. Stories now are about clicks.
Yeah.
And the objective of any media publication is to get as many clicks as possible. That's how they get their money. The more clicks, the more money you get.
Yeah.
So they're doing clickbait.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you get the whole mass confusion thing. And then, I mean, what was really surprising to me about this entire process is like how nutrition professionals themselves are kind of caught up in this entire thing. You wrote in Food Politics, food companies routinely provide information and funds to academic departments, research institutes, and professional societies. And then, in Unsavory Truth, you also said that they provide nutrition societies by helping pay for conference activities, publications, all of that stuff. So take me into that process a little bit.
Well, I go to meetings of my nutrition society, the American Society for Nutrition, and the meeting is sponsored by a whole great big long list of food companies who give money to the organization for it. The food companies sponsor specific sessions at the meetings on controversial issues. And you can bet that the people who speak at those sessions are only going to have one point of view. This is not going to be a session in which there's debate. There's going to be information disclosed about the benefits of that product. Every food company is doing that, every food trade association. If they can get dietitians to go on TikTok and say, this product is terrific and I love this product and there's nothing wrong with it, and the evidence that links this product to poor health is wrong and ridiculous and you don't have to pay any attention to it, then they're getting what they paid for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. And then one of the things that saddens me personally the most is and you alluded to this earlier, but the targeting and like exploitation of children as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there's like a playbook for children itself. And you talked about this, you've talked about this kind of extent. Can you kind of speak on that subject with children?
Well, yeah, it's very important for food companies to market to children because children, even though they don't have any money of their own, or at least not for a while, they have what is called pester ability. And they can ask their parents or caretakers to buy the product for them. And I've talked to parents who tell me, we never let our child watch commercials on television. We do not have anything about McDonald's in our house. When we drive down the street and our kid sees a McDonald's, they tell us that they want to eat there. And, I say to my 3-year-old, how do you know you want to eat there? I want to eat there. And they get hysterical if they don't stop.
Yeah.
If they don't stop, they have a meltdown. And you watch kids in supermarkets having meltdowns over products that are deliberately marketed to children. And remember, I already told you that the food industry executive said, we wish we didn't have to market to children, but we do. Because they represent an enormous fraction of their income and sales of products. Food companies are in the business of marketing products. Their goal is to sell more and at the highest price possible. That's their goal.
One of the kind of more insidious aspects is the kind of beloved kind of cartoon characters that like many of us grew up with, like Lucky the Leprechaun, or in the case of McDonald's, like Ronald McDonald. Like all of these are, they could be interchangeable with like Disney characters. And then even with McDonald's, specifically when I was growing up, they had like playpens like in McDonald's. So it'd be like this entire kind of experience that kids were having, and they were associating
it was fun to go there. It wasn't about the food at all. It was about the toys and the Happy Meals and the playgrounds.
Another aspect with with children are food dyes. So like a lot of the popular candy products, they all have like red 40, blue, all of the stuff in it. It seems like the science behind food dyes specifically is kind of extensive.
There are countries in Europe that have banned these things. There's tremendous amounts of research questioning the safety of these things. The FDA has been very slow to act. And now states are starting to take this up. So there have been several states that are passing laws saying that you can't sell products in the state that have these dyes in them. This will eventually force the FDA to act.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think, a lot of people might be sitting here wondering, like, how is this entire process, like, legal? And so what is the role of, like, the U.S. government in this entire
Well,
thing?
I think the government has an enormous role, but it's, in many cases, it's been captured by food corporations or other corporations so that they're afraid to act because they'll get sued. The FDA used to be, there was a period when the FDA was going after inappropriate health claims on food products,
Yeah.
but the companies sued the FDA
For what?
on First Amendment grounds. And the courts ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and against the FDA. So the FDA gave up. So you have a system in which the courts are captured by corporations. The government is largely captured by corporations, and it's so much trouble to fight them that nobody's willing to take it on.
Well, it seems relatively simple when it comes to something like the food additives or the food dyes. Like, couldn't the U.S. government, like, federally just ban it tomorrow?
Oh, sure. They could find some reason to do it, sure.
And then the food companies would have to stop.
I mean, they'd have to go through the process, which is long and tedious.
Yeah.
And the FDA is doing that to some extent. It's going to be forced to. If individual states refuse to sell products in their states that have certain dyes in them, the companies are going to have to stop using the dyes.
Yeah.
Because how do you sell one product to one state and one product to another? You can't do that.
Yeah.
So this will have a big effect. I think what's happening in the States is very useful.
So you feel like there's actually progress being made
It's
recently?
slow, but there's progress.
Yeah. But so why wouldn't, like, if Europe has taken these steps already to be done, how come this hasn't happened if there's so much research around it?
Because food companies are lobbying and arguing that the research isn't conclusive.
Yeah.
The first thing you do in the playbook is you cast doubt on the research. That's always the first thing, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's very easy to cast doubt on research because research is seldom perfect or totally conclusive.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the word lobbying. So I feel like lobbying is obviously a big part of this equation. If people don't know what lobbying is, listening to this right now, it's like to influence a politician or the government and persuade them to support or oppose a change in the law. So I think you've talked in your books kind of this weird dichotomy that's happening where, like, you'll see instances where a high-ranking member of the government will then go to a food company and, like, work there, and then
Oh, that's the revolving door.
Yeah.
That has its own name.
Yeah.
That's when people from food companies go to work for government or people from government go to work for food companies. There's a lot of that.
Which is obvious conflict of interest.
Well, you would think so, but you can understand why a food company would want to hire a former government official.
Yeah.
Because that government official will tell them how to get through all the government regulations.
Yeah.
Very useful. And also they pay better.
So wait, so how does lobbying, like, practically work? Like,
You just provide information. You make an appointment to talk to the staff of a congressman or congressional representative, and you bring information and you go in and you say, we're very concerned about this issue because this issue is going to affect our company in certain ways. If this bill passes, we're going to have to get rid of 200 jobs in your community. That kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and then there's obviously the aspect of this, I guess the government's attempt at regulating food safety is this program called GRASS. What's the status of that today, and can you explain that?
Yeah, it's very hard to explain because it has to do with food additive regulations. And in 1958, the Congress passed a law that divided food additives into two categories, basically new ones and old ones. New ones had to go through an approval process. Old ones were considered generally recognized as safe because they'd been around for a long time.
Which is what GRASS stands for.
That's what it stands for,
Yeah.
GRAS, GRASS, one S, generally recognized as safe. So that would be salt or sugar or something like that would be generally recognized as safe. And that lasted until the 1970s when the FDA got busy with other things and didn't have enough time. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of food additives on the market. There are really lots of them. And you don't know what they are, and they're used in very small quantities, and most of them haven't been studied very well. So in the 1970s, the FDA changes its procedure and said that instead of having to go through this big proposal of doing the research, the companies could do their own research and just let the FDA know about it.
Yeah.
But they didn't have to let the FDA know about it. They could just do it voluntarily. And they could just say, we think that this additive we're using is grass for human consumption. And the FDA would look at the letter that was written by the company and either say, okay, we don't have any questions, or if for some reason or other it triggered a question, they would write back and say, better take another look at it. But in general, it's a very loose procedure, and there's, I think, pretty much widespread agreement that the FDA doesn't do enough to monitor food additives.
Well, they're chronically understaffed as well.
But they're understaffed for everything.
Yeah.
And so the question you have to ask is, where do food additives fit into everything else that the FDA is doing in the food area?
Yeah.
How important are food additives relative to food safety or or food labeling or some of the other things that the FDA is doing? But they're certainly not doing enough about food additives, but that's a congressional problem.
Yeah.
Because Congress doesn't give the FDA enough money to do it. And this is another sort of thing, and I'm always complaining about, nobody else does, but this is my particular complaint, is that the FDA gets its funding from congressional agriculture committees. This is a historical anomaly left over from 1906 when the FDA was part of the USDA. And so all its funding went through USDA funding committees. But now the FDA gets its funding from agriculture committees, not public health committees, even though the FDA is part of the Public Health Service.
Yeah.
And the Public Health Service gets its funding through Health and Human Services, but not FDA.
So can you explain to me why that's a big issue?
Because why would agriculture committees be the slightest bit interested in the FDA?
Yeah.
They don't like regulation anyway.
Yeah.
And they certainly don't care about the FDA. It's not their problem.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this seems like it's basically not really regulated well at all, especially with what you were describing with grass. And if the food companies are already going to these great lengths to and have this playbook, then to depend on them to kind of self-report.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, that's absurd. And the FDA has two areas where it really doesn't do much.
Yeah.
And that's food additives and dietary supplements.
Yeah.
And dietary supplements they can't touch because there was a law passed in 1994 that essentially deregulated dietary supplements and kept the FDA out of it. And when the FDA tried to stay in it, that's when the courts ruled against them.
One of the things that I was researching is a lot of the food additives that were in use before the 1950s were kind of just grandfathered in as safe. And so there's relative uncertainty around that. And then you have the food additives that there's been studies around, and there's like a known correlation between that and chronic disease. And so it just seems like obviously a huge risk to continue consuming the products.
Yeah, I mean, I see food additives as a black hole.
Well, a lot of these things that are the food additives, they're chemicals, but in a sense, they're unnatural to the human body. They're being made in a lab, no?
Yeah, so avoid them.
Yeah.
Read food labels and avoid them. And worry about how many calories you're eating.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, there's so many levels here with this conversation that I feel like it could be overwhelming for people of, there's a playbook, there's an agenda, there's food around us everywhere. Like, what do I do? What would you say is kind of like your starting point to taking control of your health?
Oh, I think diets are really simple. really simple. Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. If you do that, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. Food being defined as foods that are processed or relatively unprocessed, but not ultra-processed.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that you have to do to modify. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That really takes care of it. And enjoy what you eat, I would throw in also, because it's one of life's greatest pleasures.
Yeah. One of the bigger things that has been kind of more research recently has been this idea of the term bio-individuality, in the sense that there's no one-size-fits-all diet.
Oh, you're talking about precision nutrition, the way the field is going these days.
Yeah. So the idea that, there's a lot of people who will swear by the fact that they went carnivore, and it does seem like they just got completely healed. Doesn't mean they like completely eliminated plants for like their whole life, but they went carnivore and it healed whatever gut issues that they were having. And then you have people that are swearing by the idea of going like vegetarian, or even Michael Pollan's quote, mostly plants. And so what exactly is going on there?
Individual variation,
Yeah.
hard to know, very difficult to know without studying it carefully. And, the nutrition field is moving in the direction of precision nutrition, where they're trying to identify individual biomarker levels and so forth.
You have a new chapter that we were talking about earlier come out in your book about organic. So does organic make a difference?
Yeah, it does, because you're not getting as heavy levels of pesticides. And organics is about production values. So the organic producers are producing foods in ways that are much better for the environment.
How so?
They're replenishing soil. They're not using fertilizers or harmful pesticides, or as harmful pesticides. So that's good for the soil. It's good for the environment.
So
Kinder to climate change.
You mentioned earlier, though, that all foods to some extent have pesticides on them.
Well, yeah, because they're everywhere. Absolutely everywhere.
So what does organic guarantee then when it comes to
That it
pesticides?
doesn't have a specific list of harmful pesticides that are excluded, and that it's produced in ways that follow the organic rules of the Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
It's codified. Organic is codified in the United States.
Yeah, and then obviously, when it comes to certain companies or products, I think a lot of the popular makers of junk food, obviously avoiding those. And then the idea of just eating whole foods. Is that something that?
Yeah, not ultra-processed.
Yeah.
Whole or minimally or lightly processed foods. Right.
So the other aspect of this is kind of where to shop. And so let's talk about supermarkets. Whole Foods has, we talked about earlier kind of the illusion of great prices. Obviously, Whole Foods has this kind of catchphrase of like whole food, a whole paycheck or something like that. So obviously they've been criticized for high prices, I think. But one thing I admire about what they've done, curious your opinion on this, is that if you walk in the store, they've committed to banning like 250 ingredients or something from ever showing up in their store. So it seems like just by shopping there, you'd have a better health outcome.
Yeah, and they have a lot of organic food.
Yeah.
I'll give them a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. What would you say about those who can't afford to shop at a
Well,
place?
I see that as a political issue.
Yeah.
There are reasons why the cost of ultra-processed foods is so low relative to the cost of fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And that's something the government could get involved in.
Yeah. That makes me think, I had something on here about even what the government kind of funds. And so government incentives being handed out. And so in 2021, there's about $28 billion being handed out to farms to grow like the 5 major crops, corn, soy, wheat, cotton, and rice. And so all of those are common ingredients in junk food, but
ultra-processed junk food.
Yeah. And so, but they handed out like virtually no money to kind of smaller farms putting out.
Yeah, those are considered specialty crops. Fruits and vegetables.
Are considered
Specialty crops.
Why is that?
Our food system is designed for industrial agriculture. And if you look, for example, at corn production, 45% of the corn that's produced in the United States goes to feed for animals. Another 45% goes to ethanol to fuel automobiles, leaving 10% or less of the corn that's produced for ingredients that go into processed food and corn that's consumed by people.
Yeah, so obviously the government doesn't have to hand things out the way that you do.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Good luck changing it.
Yeah, I mean, is there you've talked about this idea of voting with your fork, but is there any way we can do anything from like a regulation standpoint?
Yeah, elect officials who are more interested in public health and corporate health.
I don't see this issue even when you think about the presidential election, it doesn't seem like it's talked about as much as like other things in general.
Well, that's because people feel totally intimidated by the political system.
Yeah.
They feel helpless in the face of it when there's so much corruption and corporations have totally taken over.
Yeah.
So you want to elect officials who care about the public and care about public issues. That would help a lot.
What about parents of children and stuff like that? You mentioned.
Well, then the parents are fighting the whole food system on their own. That's a lot to ask of parents.
Yeah.
It's really hard. When the a $1.5 trillion food system is aimed at getting their kid to demand products from their caretakers. And who wants to fight with their kids about food? I never did.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that any parent wants to fight with their kids about food. It's really unpleasant and you have to do it 3 times a day or more. Nobody wants to do that. But once you understand that in fighting with your kid about food, what you're really fighting is a food system that has put this extraordinary amount of money, billions and billions of dollars a year, into trying to get your kid to demand products. It makes you want to fight back a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even in terms of conversations with kids and stuff like that, like if you were a parent today, like what would those conversations be for you?
Well, I didn't have to fight with my kids. My kids are old. I didn't have to fight with them quite the way. I mean, we fought about cereal. I do, and they'd remind me that we fought about cereal. I refused to buy junky cereals. Now I think kids are smart. You just explain what the situation is. They're trying to get you to buy this. Let's look at this ad together.
Yeah.
Let's teach kids media literacy. Let's watch this advertisement. What is this advertisement trying to do?
Yeah.
What are they trying to tell you?
That's really
Well,
good.
how do you feel about that? Yeah. I can tell you how I feel about that.
Yeah.
You talk to your kids about it.
That's really good. Yeah, I think just even having this conversation, I think the idea of awareness around this, I think a lot of people live in oblivion of in terms of like what's actually happening around them with food and the food system. And so I think it's empowering in a sense just to like have the information, to spread the information, which obviously you've done such a beautiful job of over the past.
That's why I write books.
Yeah.
and one of them is a cartoon book, so it's really easy to read.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, to kind of end on a personal note, I think you're also like a testament to good health. Like you seem like you're very vibrant, even at like 87, going around doing stuff.
Doddering away here.
Yeah. And so I assume that you've practiced all these principles yourself.
Well, I think they're very easy to follow.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, because, it's not that hard to do once you get the hang of it.
Yeah.
And I don't buy a lot of junk food. Do I buy junk food ever? Of course I do. I have my likes. And none of these things are totally prescriptive.
Yeah.
It's just what your general basic habits are. And if you're generally eating healthfully and you're eating real food and you're not eating too much and you make sure that you got fruits and vegetables, you don't have to worry about any of that other stuff. It takes care of itself.
Yeah, I think that provides like a lot of hope for people, especially when it comes to early death, chronic disease, all this stuff, and the attitude that like that's just going to happen to you as you get older. And So it's certainly inspiring for me to sit in front of you and see that, you know.
Yeah, I think you don't want to gain weight.
Yeah.
You really don't. And I know that's a big controversial issue now.
Yeah.
But I see avoiding weight gain as part of fighting a $1.5 trillion
Yeah.
food system that's trying to get you to gain as much weight as possible, because the more you weigh, the more you have to eat.
Yeah. Well, I think the science in that regard is pretty well. I mean, even if you look at the science of fasting and stuff like that, the body for periods of time when it's like has no food, and then just eating less in general, I think that, and even if you think about for most of human history, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, like we're living in a moment of scarcity, of food scarcity. And so it's literally impossible for you to like overeat for most of human history. You're going hunting your food. But now it's like so unnatural to eat just copious amounts of food. And the human body isn't even like designed to.
Doesn't handle it very well.
Yeah, it doesn't handle it well.
Doesn't handle it well. But we have a food system that's designed deliberately for purposes of profit
Yeah.
to get people to eat as much as possible.
Yeah.
And that's, a concept that I think it would be useful for people to understand,
Yeah.
because then it makes decision-making much easier.
Yeah.
That it's not your decision, it's you're in this system that is rigged.
Yeah.
It's rigged.